Sup y'all, and welcome to Regional and Interregional Interactions, Part 3. In this video, we're going to look at the Mongol Empire and ask this essential question: how did the Mongols affect the Eurasian civilizations, and in turn, how did these civilizations affect the Mongols? We've already learned that civilizations sprouted up in places where people resided in favorable environments conducive to sedentary living, made possible through farming and animal husbandry. However, in the more arid and semi-arid climates, very little rain falls, but the windswept plains produce hardy grasses, good for grazing, in places like the Eurasian steppes, sub-Saharan Africa, the Arabian and Saharan deserts, Tibet, and some subarctic northern latitudes. People in these regions developed herding societies constructed around horses, camels, goats, sheep, cattle, yaks, or reindeer. Pastoralists could only support smaller populations since their way of life was so extensive, and they had to be mobile, leading their animals to good grazing lands as the seasons changed. This meant they spent most of their days in the saddle and most nights in tents, such as yurts. Pastoralist women had more rights and freedoms than their agrarian counterparts, partly because their labor and contributions were greatly needed due to the smaller populations. For instance, Mongol women often served as military advisors. Over time, the nomadic pastoralists and agrarian civilizations traded, negotiated, and sometimes fought against each other. After 1000 BCE, nomads along Inner Eurasia became adept at horseback riding, and over time they acquired or developed saddles with stirrups, complex horse harnesses, armor, and weapons, such as the compound bow that they could fire while on horseback, giving them a powerful edge in battle against regular infantry on foot. But no pastoralist society had as great an impact as the Mongols, who burst upon the Eurasian scene in the early 13th century. After the unification of several nomadic tribes under Temujin, who was called Genghis Khan, sometimes pronounced Chinggis Khan, meaning universal ruler. Starting their conquest in 1206, they would eventually establish the largest contiguous empire in human history. Since the Mongols were really a fractious collection of tribes and clans aligned only by their own kinship links, numbering perhaps a mere 1 million in total, conquest proved to be a logical and powerful centripetal force, giving all of them a common task. The acquisition of goods and territory enabled Genghis Khan to placate his followers, whether they be allies or rivals. They were not always successful, withdrawing from Eastern Europe and losing in battle against the Egyptians and most ominously at the hands of the Japanese. In 1281, the Mongols sent thousands of ships and around 140,000 troops against Japan, only to be outmatched by the samurai and ultimately bested by a typhoon that destroyed much of their flotilla and forcing them to retreat. The Japanese called this storm the kamikaze, meaning divine wind. Regardless, the Mongols were highly successful. Some of it was lucky timing, in which the Chinese to the east had already lost their northern territories to the rival Jin dynasty, and to the west, the Abbasid Caliphate had shrunk dramatically from its strongest years. Nonetheless, the Mongol army proved to be its greatest strength. Genghis Khan structured the military into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, allowing them great mobility and fluidity in battle. With so many riding on horseback, they would rapidly encircle, purposely retreat, and counterattack with unmasked ferocity. As they conquered new territories, they plundered great wealth from them, and forced many of the conquered people to serve in the military, meanwhile sending skilled laborers to build roads and bridges across their expanding empire. The Mongols were masters at psychological warfare, purposely utilizing barbarous brutality to dishearten their adversaries. If people submitted, they were often spared, but if they resisted, then the Mongols ruthlessly and violently killed all the men, women, and children alike. Just seeing a Mongol army ride up on the gates of a city would often lead the inhabitants to surrender without putting up a fight. The Mongols, nonetheless, were resourceful and cunning, setting up an accurate census to effectively tax the conquered people, and organizing a system of relay stations providing rapid communication across their vast empire. Merchants were usually offered more than the asking price to keep goods flowing across the Silk Road, and the Mongols were often very tolerant of other religions, usually allowing Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and others to freely practice their beliefs, provided they did not resist against them. In this way, what is truly remarkable is how small a lasting imprint the Mongols had on the cultures of the civilizations they conquered, almost never assimilating others into their language, religion, or way of life. This is a stark contrast to the Muslim empires that spread almost as impressively during this era, but who permanently altered the regions they conquered, linguistically, religiously, and physically through their unique cultural landscape. Nonetheless, the Mongols had an impact on the civilizations they came into contact with, and in turn, these civilizations had an impact on the Mongols. To analyze this systematically, we will use the acronym SPIRE, and look first to the Chinese, in which the Mongols had a much greater impact on them than vice versa. Socially, the Mongols relegated the Chinese to a lower class and forbade intermarriage between ethnicities. The Mongols relied more on foreigners as officials, largely ignoring the long-held examination system. Politically, the Mongols unified China once again under the Great Khanate, which was an authoritarian governmental system with a Khan as the head. The Mongols moved their capital from Karakorum to Khanbalik, meaning City of the Khan, in what is now Beijing. Ideologically, the Mongols were very accommodating and allowed the Chinese to maintain most of their way of life. This led many Chinese to believe the Mongols had been granted the mandate of heaven. Regionally, the Mongols did have many roads, bridges, and canals built, connecting the empire even more. Economically, the Mongols extracted a great deal of wealth from China and led to increased trade, both within the empire and in connection with the greater world at large. However, the Chinese impact on the Mongols was much less. For instance, the success of Chinese agriculture convinced the Mongols to keep most farmland intact and not change them into a nomadic society. The famous Kublai Khan ruled over China from 1271 to 1294 and took the title as the first Yuan emperor. While Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism were allowed to be practiced, most Mongols remained distinct and separate. China did offer the Mongols a rich and resourceful region as a base, on the far eastern edge of their empire, in which they could grow from. The Mongols also gained goods, wealth, and technology they could use to their advantage, such as catapult and battering rams that they utilized to conquer other peoples across Eurasia. The Mongols also had a much greater impact in Russia than the Russians had on them. The region was divided and less urban, offering less to the Mongols than most other conquered territories. Socially, many laborers and skilled craftsmen were deported to other regions or sold into slavery. Politically, Russia became part of the Khanate of the Golden Horde, also referred to as the Kipchak Khanate, named after a group of people in that area. The influence of Kiev was decimated, leading to the rise of Moscow, that would eventually lead Russia into a new age after the Mongol rule had subsided. Due to Mongol religious toleration, the Orthodox Church flourished and expanded into the countryside, usually exempted from taxation. Regionally, the Mongols largely remained in the steppes, since they figured the Russians had little to offer. The Mongols would only involve themselves with Russian affairs when they saw fit. Economically, the Mongols did bring more access to trade. Additionally, many nobles assisted the Mongols in their raids, since they could share in the loot. On the other hand, the Russian impact on the Mongols was minimal at best. Since Russia had no garrison cities and was technologically backward, it was indirectly occupied from afar. Since the Mongols primarily remained in the steppes, there was minimal exchange due to distance decay, in which interaction diminishes with increased distance. Russia was mostly a land of independent princes and divided lands, so they had little to offer the Mongols. Regardless, they did provide the Mongols with tribute and goods for as long as they were under their control. When it came to the Persians, the Mongols in this region were far more impacted than in China and especially in Russia. Much of this can be explained ideologically. Since Islam was a universalizing religion, many Mongols converted and most of the elites learned the Persian language, whereas the Mongolian imprint on Persian culture was minimal. Socially, many Mongols changed from their nomadic ways and became sedentary farmers. Additionally, a large number married locals. Nonetheless, the Mongols left their mark through the many massacres. For instance, the sacking of Baghdad in 1258 led to around 200,000 Persians killed, often brutally. And until the Mongols were assimilated, women often enjoyed greater power and rights. Politically, the Mongols utilized the extensive Persian bureaucracy, relegating most of the governmental operations to the Persians. Nonetheless, Mongol leaders in Persia took on the title of Il-Khan, meaning subordinate Khan, establishing the Il-Khanate of Persia. Regionally, the Mongols largely neglected the Khanates, an intricate Persian irrigation system, turning productive agricultural land into pastures or deserts. Although the Mongols were fond of expanding wine grape production, whereas most Persian Muslims refrained from consuming alcohol. Economically, the Mongols did increase trade in Persia, although they incurred heavy taxes on the peasants, collected often more than 20 times a year. Many couldn't afford the cost, even under the threat of torture, and many were forced off their land and into the depths of poverty. Arguably, the Europeans, especially in the West, gained the most from the Mongol invasions, and primarily because they were not directly attacked. While the Mongols didn't produce much of anything of great value, they taxed the trade between regions and thus ensured its proliferation. Increased trade enabled the Europeans to acquire goods from far and wide, as well as new crops and valuable technologies and innovations. That said, not all that was transmitted across the Silk Road was beneficial, especially with reference to the bubonic plague, the Black Death. With an initial outbreak in 1331 in China, the plague spread across the Eurasian Mongol network through fleas on the backs of rodents, making its way into Europe by 1347. Due to the massive loss of life, the volume of trade diminished drastically, and the trade routes that empowered the Mongols largely subsided. By mid-14th century, the once powerful and imposing Mongol Empire fell into disarray. One by one, the Khanates were either conquered or greatly weakened. The unprecedented success of the Mongols was truly remarkable, but like the other empires that rose before them, their days had been numbered and eventually came to an end.
That is correct.